In this video, we're going to explore how Theosophy, a major spiritual movement that began in the late 19th century, influenced the visual arts, and how it contributed to the burgeoning abstraction of art. Let's begin with its founder, Helena Blavatsky. Helena Blavatsky was a Russian mystic who spent much of her life traveling the globe. She spent time in Europe, in America, in Tibet, and finally in India. And as a child, it was reported that she talked to everything as if it were alive. She could communicate with plants, with rocks, and with spirits. She read archaic volumes voraciously, and at the age of 19, she ran away from an unwanted marriage and traveled extensively through Europe. A wise Indian sage appeared to her in spirit form and told her that he was watching over her and that she was to go to Tibet to increase her psychic and spiritual studies. Helena had several of these Indian spirit guides appear to her throughout her lifetime, and she called them the Masters. She claimed that they were real people on Earth who could basically transport their consciousness to appear and guide her when needed. Later, she claimed that there was the consciousness of another master living inside of her and guiding her to write her famous works. These works were called Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine. In her lifetime, she made several attempts to enter into Tibet in order to learn the ways of the masters, but it was difficult because Tibet did not allow insiders into their holy city, much less lone women traveling as men, which Blavatsky would sometimes pass herself off as when she was younger. She made it into the holy city of Tibet, the city of the Dalai Lama, on the second or third attempt, and began to study the ancient mystery traditions of Tibet. Her psychic powers developed, and people reported wonderful and strange things happening when they were around her. In one instance, when she went on a picnic with her friends and followers, they did not bring enough teacups for the amount of people there. So she told her friend to dig under a nearby tree, and when he did, he found an extra teacup in the dirt that matched the exact china set they had brought. She could also make objects levitate, or make things she wanted from another room pass through walls to get to her. All of this came from her extensive studying in Tibet, where she learned royal yoga. It's not the type of yoga that you think about today, in which there's mainly physical postures and breathing lessons, but it was a type of yoga that developed the spiritual powers. Letters from the masters containing advice and more teachings would also spontaneously appear in one of her cupboards throughout her lifetime. So she was always receiving these teachings through these letters that would just appear in her cupboards while she slept overnight. Of course, when one is so famous for doing miracles or doing kind of spectacular feats, there are always accusations of fraud. And there was actually an investigation into Blavatsky's miracles, and at the end of the investigation, they concluded that she was a fake. There are others that defend her still as an honest and genuine soul. Whatever stance you take on her psychic abilities does not affect the historical accuracy that she started the group called the Theosophical Society while she was living in America. She then traveled to India to found the headquarters of the Theosophical Society and to spread its message. The Theosophical Society did not have a specific set of dogma that it centered itself around, but those who joined it learned a combination of mystery school teachings and Eastern philosophy. Mystery schools are secret societies that have existed since ancient times. In ancient Greece, there was the Pythagorean school, and today we have what is known as the Freemasons. Even some subsects of the Catholic Church have mystery teachings. These teachings are considered too powerful to teach everyone. Only people who were emotionally and spiritually ready could receive these teachings. Thus, the mystery schools kept their knowledge a mystery. Therefore, only people who had been initiated into the group could learn this hermetic wisdom and special practices. Hermetic simply means sealed or airtight. So this wisdom was sealed up, it was bound up, it wasn't for everyone. And the people who were initiated into the group were called initiates. The mystery schools taught knowledge that revealed the mysteries of the universe or explained the nature of reality, whereas the spiritual practices they taught were practices that allowed you to work with energy, to work with the spiritual realm. They were usually a meditative sort of practice, and they allowed the initiates to raise their consciousness in order to be able to perceive hidden realities. So the Theosophical Society was taking many of its teachings from these mystery schools. One of the mystery schools that it incorporated was called Rosicrucianism, or the Rosicrucian Order. And this mystery school was very influential for many of the spiritual societies in the late 1800s. I don't want to delve into what this Rosicrucian order taught too much because we will actually be learning a lot of its teachings through Theosophy. Another influence on Theosophy's doctrines were the concepts that were familiar in Eastern religions and traditions. They became accepted tenets of the Theosophical Society. Blavatsky introduced the idea of reincarnation into the West. It was no longer the idea that you were born once, you die, and then you go to heaven or hell for eternity. That was a Christian idea. But the Eastern idea of reincarnation was the belief that a soul is repeatedly born into the physical world until it completes its spiritual journey of growth and evolution. So physical incarnation was seen as a trial that allows the soul to purify itself and become more spiritually evolved. And you will keep incarnating into physical reality until you purify your soul and learn all the lessons that you're supposed to learn. Reincarnation is a process of birth, living, death, and then being reborn into the physical again, birth, living, death. So it's over and over going back and forth between the spirit realm into the physical realm, the spirit realm, and then the physical realm. And Blavatsky said that this is what basically allows you, this process allows you to become more spiritually evolved. And we see that idea of spiritual evolution again, just like with Swedenborg, except Swedenborg didn't promote reincarnation. Now, Blavatsky claimed that studying royal yoga in Tibet was the key to opening up her psychic powers. And like I said, it was nothing like the yoga that you probably practice in your yoga class today. Royal yoga was more about developing the mind or the psyche, and it centered around energetic and meditative work. If you ever go to a yoga class today, though, you can still thank Blavatsky as one of the first people that started to introduce Eastern ideas and make them more popular in Western culture. So the Theosophical Society preached spiritual evolution, and it also preached the idea of acceptance for all. They were trying to create a universal brotherhood for humanity, something that was centered around common principles of truth, something that got rid of religion and anything that was divisive. In a way, Theosophy was trying to dig underneath all these different belief systems and find a common foundation. Blavatsky believed that no one religion or group held the truth, but that there were remnants of truth in all religions and belief systems. So by comparing religion, philosophy, and science, you can get at the essence of truth. In fact, the motto of the Theosophical Society was, "There is no religion higher than truth." I will repeat that again. There is no religion higher than truth. Truth was the foundation of everything, and she thought that by taking the big picture, the comparative picture, by finding the truth in religion, by finding the truth in philosophy, by finding the truth in science, and pulling all those bits together, by comparing all those different fields of study, you can find what was the actual truth. So I want to read to you the aims of the Theosophical Society so that you can see what it was about. The first aim that the Theosophical Society claims is to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color. So she's trying to make a very humanitarian organization, an organization that welcomes everyone. The second aim of the Theosophical Society was to encourage the study of comparative religion, philosophy, and science. And there we see she's asking you to study different forms of knowledge and to try to bring them all together. It's a very inclusive society. And lastly, it says to investigate the unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in man. And like I said, that's a very mystery school kind of aim. They're trying to figure out the nature of reality. Interestingly enough, Blavatsky didn't approve of the spiritualist movement. She said that people who participated in these seances didn't really know what they were dealing with, and that when they thought they were talking to their long-lost loved ones, they were actually talking to any spirit who wanted to impersonate their departed loved ones. Mediums were dealing with ghosts and lower spiritual life forms, and Blavatsky said that unless you had undergone training, you weren't really ready to deal with the spirit world. The spiritual world had rules and laws of its own, which were different from the physical world. Therefore, she said you must learn the nature of these laws before you jumped into a spiritual realm where up may be down and down may be up. But ironically, spiritualist camps, like the summer camps that we talked about in the last lesson, allowed for the entrance of Blavatsky's ideas. They allowed for the entrance of Eastern mysticism into American thought. Spiritualist newspapers published a number of esoteric articles written by Blavatsky just as she was founding the Theosophical Society. And many of those people who attended the spiritualist summer camps read those newspapers, so in a way, spiritualist camps helped spread Blavatsky's message. The teachings of the Theosophical Society are vast, and the two works that Blavatsky wrote, Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine, are huge books. They're encyclopedic books. In fact, Isis Unveiled is 2 volumes, and each volume is 700 pages. Therefore, we cannot cover everything that they believed. However, I feel like if we look at this one symbol called the tetractys, we can divine several ideas of how they viewed reality or how they explained reality through looking at this symbol. I'm not just pulling this symbol out of the air. Blavatsky does refer to this tetractys several times in Isis Unveiled. And supposedly the tetractys was an ancient symbol from Pythagoras' time that explains the nature of reality. You can see that it's 10 dots making an equilateral triangle. 1 dot at the top, 2 dots on the second layer, 3 dots in the third layer, 4 dots at the bottom row. The tetractys is also known as the Pyramid of Emanation, and it's basically a reality map that can be used to understand more about existence through the connection and the relativity of the points, or the emanations that make it up. Let's look at the first row of the tetractys with its 1 point and consider the possible meanings. This singular point at the top represents the idea that there is one singular source behind all of creation. It represents the idea that everything in creation came from one source. This is the first point of divinity where all other emanations are created from. It represents the oneness of creation. The belief that behind all the different various forms of life, there is one spirit or one source or one creator enlivening everything. The creation is like a mirror that has been shattered, and all the different pieces are just parts of the creator, and they form to create the creator. If this reminds you at all of Blake's idea of the universal human, of Swedenborg's idea of the universal human, in which all of humanity collectively comes together to create Jesus, it's kind of a similar idea. The shape of the circle or the sphere is commonly associated with this one indivisible source. The source is seen as something that's whole. It's whole by itself, and there's no division to it. So the sphere also has no division of edges. It's not a cube, it's not an octagon, it's just one. Other names that might help you to understand what I mean by this word source or spirit is the void, unity, singularity, or the monotheistic idea of God. Now the second row with the two circles of the tetractys represents the idea of splitting up that one source into two. So the one now becomes two. It's the first division of the one, and I sometimes think of cells splitting when I think of this division. It represents the idea of duality in nature. The belief that there are opposites that are on the same spectrum. For example, the opposites of masculine or feminine, creation or destruction. The Chinese opposites of yin and yang, the emotional opposites of love and hate, the visual opposites of light and dark. All of these opposites are believed to be the extremes of the same spectrum. And the reason why the mystery schools believed that opposition was necessary is because growth can only come out of opposition. So when two forces push against each other, they cause change. And change is growth. Change is motion. Change is going forward. Because if there's only the one, if we go back to the original void, the source, the creator, the one is just sitting there. He's already whole. She, he, whoever you want to say, they're already whole. The source is already complete. It doesn't need anything else. But as soon as you split that force into two, there's separation, and that separation causes friction, and that friction causes growth. Now the third row, which has the three circles, that represents the creation of something new when those two polar opposites combine. It's the Trinity energy. An example of this is the mother, the father, and the child. When the mother and the father combine, they make the child. And the child is a completely separate and different individual than the mother and the father. It's the idea that the combination of two separate things make something completely different. For example, water, which is H2O, has completely separate properties than its components, hydrogen and oxygen. The three-in-one idea, or the Trinity idea, is seen as the energetic blueprint for both God and man. God is seen as having three persons in one, and man is considered three bodies in one. So we know God is seen as God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. That's a very common knowledge in the Christian tradition. But in the mystery traditions, there's also this idea that man has three parts to him too. The mental body, which is anchored in the head, the emotional body, which is anchored in the heart, and the physical body, which is anchored in the gut. The Theosophists saw these three bodies as existing in different dimensions and being layered on top of each other. The fusion of these three different bodies created a living being. That's why you hear people referring to body, mind, and spirit if they're part of the wellness, health, or New Age community, because there's the belief that you're three in one. And three is associated with the shape of the triangle or the pyramid. Lastly, the four dots in the final row of the tetractys represent a further separation and division. The four contribute to the character of the individual. You can see them as the building blocks of furthering individuality. They are actually two sets of polar opposites. In the Bible, the four corners of the earth are mentioned. Also, mystery schools believed in the four elements: fire, air, water, earth, which combine together to create everything. 4 is the number associated with the material plane, with coming into being. It's the divine source finally manifesting itself into physical reality. And both the cube and the cross are associated with this physical reality. Now, if you think of the cube, it has 4 sides, and the cross has 4 points or 4 arms. Think of phrases like boxed in or think outside of the box. They show the limiting nature of the cube because when you're boxed in, you have nowhere to go. And if you think outside of the box, you're showing creativity. You're not limited by the 4. Now, the cross is also associated with this physical reality and the number 4 because the cross is the idea that you're bearing the limitations of this physical reality. If you've ever heard the phrases, take up your cross, or bearing your cross, it's the idea that you're bearing the burdens that come with actually living in a physical reality. All of the points of the tetractys add up to 10, which corresponds back to unity or completion. Our whole numeric system is based on the number of 10, right? 10, 20, 30, everything is a division of 10. Blavatsky used symbols like the tetractys in order to illustrate the nature of reality. She also used many other symbols to explain the nature of reality, but I think this one symbol was enough to show us how she thought the cosmos was ordered. Let's start looking at some of the art that was influenced by some of these theosophical concepts and symbols. The first artist that we're going to look at in consideration of how Theosophy affected art is Pierre Mondrian, who was a famous Dutch painter, and he's celebrated for being a pioneer of 20th century abstract art. He began as a figurative painter, but his style morphed into a completely abstract process. You may recognize some of his most famous works, such as composition with red, blue, and yellow, or Boardwalk Boogie Woogie. His works became so famous that many times you will find these red, blue, and yellow abstract paintings on many different things like purses, chairs. They're printed everywhere. So hopefully you've seen some of his more mature work in other contexts. But his earlier figurative painting was actually heavily influenced by Theosophy. Mondrian kept a copy called The Great Initiates by Edward Chouret by his bedside until the end of his life, and Chouret was a theosophist. The work we're going to be taking a look at is called Evolution, and it's from 1911. Already we can see that the title of the work shows us what spiritual philosophy he's focusing in on: evolution, the spiritual evolution of humankind. So this triptych shows 3 androgynous human forms that are in different stages of enlightenment. There's heraldic flowers and triangles on either side of them. There's actually something about the figures that reminds me of Egyptian statuary, because Egyptian statuary was very rigid and symmetrical, and the way that these figures are so geometrical and so stiff really reminds me of that. Now, most scholars read the paintings as a series of enlightenment for mankind, so it shows man's awakening towards higher consciousness. Some scholars read this evolution from left to middle to right. Others read this evolution from left to right to center, and they see the center figure as the embodiment of enlightenment or the fully awakened individual. I tend to believe that it is the figure on the right that is actually showing the awakened and aware individual. But let's start with the left image and we'll move from the left to the middle to the right. In the left image, the woman has a belly button and nipples that are both downward facing triangles. The flowers behind her also have a downward pointing black triangle for their center. And this figure is generally believed to represent matter, or unaware consciousness that's the physical reality. The red color of the flowers on her shoulders lends to this idea of physical reality because red is typically associated with pure, raw physicality. It's associated with the root chakra, which is usually at the base of a person, at the end of the spine. And the root chakra is seen as the energy center that deals with pure physical survival. In contrast to the figure on the left, the center figure has its eyes wide open, as if it's experiencing a moment of spiritual awakeness or enlightenment. She has a golden aura around her shoulders, and her belly button and nipples are now upward-facing triangles. There are also 2 white triangles on top of her shoulders, this time pointing up, and 2 white triangles on either side of her temples pointing down. She is looking upwards towards the divine. The sets of triangles, one pointing up and one pointing down, seem to have to do with coalescing both the spiritual and the physical realm. So she's starting to bring the spiritual realm down. She's starting to merge these 2 realities. And in the last figure, the 2 triangles have been completely merged into the Star of David. The one triangle pointing downward represents matter, and the other triangle pointing upwards represents spirit. And they coalesce into the 6-sided star of Theosophy. So Theosophy adopted many symbols that were previously sacred to other religions and other groups. In Theosophy's seal, you can see these 2 merged triangles that create the Star of David with a Ankh inside of that. The Ouroboros snake curls around the outside of the seal, and there is a swastika at the top and an Om on top of that. Now, I will dive further into each of these symbols as we go on, but I'd like to just quickly say that the swastika was not a Nazi symbol at the time. The swastika is actually an ancient Indian symbol, and that the Nazis were aware of its potent symbolism, and that's why they took it and they actually flipped it. They reversed it so that it was actually spinning in another direction, and they used it for their campaigns. But I just wanted to point out that the swastika wasn't inherently the evil symbol that we see it as today. Continuing on with the final figure of Mondrian's evolution, we also notice that her belly button and nipples are now diamond shapes instead of either upward or downward facing triangles. Therefore, both of the triangles have been merged in her anatomy too. The way that her head hangs back and her eyes are closed signifies a state of eternal repose. It's actually, interestingly enough, the same pose that you started with on the left. Therefore, I can understand why some scholars read it as left, right, middle. Those scholars are probably reading it as the left represents matter, the right represents a merging of the spiritual and the physical, and the middle represents an ascension into the spiritual, a fully awakened individual with eyes wide open. As I said, in the Theosophical Society, the downward and upward pointing triangles together basically indicate the opposing principles of matter and spirit, which sometimes interpenetrate and achieve balance in the sacred hexagram. In Blavatsky's own words, she writes, "The triangle played a prominent part in the religious symbolism of every great nation, for everywhere it represented the 3 great principles, spirit, force, and matter, or the active, parentheses male, passive, parentheses female, and the dual or correlative principle which partakes of both and binds the 2 together." So once again, it's this idea of mother, father, child, the binding of the 2 opposites to create something new. And one of the reasons why Mondrian may have made this figure look androgynous instead of expressly male or female is to show the union of these 2 principles. I would now like us to turn our attention to Hilma af Klint, an artist whose spiritual beliefs always influenced her art from her earliest days to her later works. She began producing works with spiritualist methods and then moved on to spiritualist symbolism. Later in life, she finally delved into anthroposophy, which we will move on to in the next lecture. But Hilma was a Swedish woman who belonged to one of the first generations of women to receive a higher education at the Royal Academy in Stockholm. If you remember in our last lecture, we talked about how the 19th century was the first time that women could really pursue painting as a profession. While she was studying at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts, she studied the traditional methods of drawing and painting, mainly portrait and landscape painting. So you can see here one of her earlier works is very traditional. I almost find some of her earlier work blasé. I probably wouldn't look at it if it wasn't for her spiritual work. Hilma, however, graduated with honors, and she was awarded a scholarship in the form of a studio in the main part of Stockholm. Now, as a teenager, Hilma participated in spiritualistic seances. She and 4 other like-minded female artists founded what was called the Friday Group in 1896. It was also called the Five. And it was called the Friday Group because every Friday they met for spiritual meetings, and there were 5 of them. These spiritual meetings included prayers, studies of the New Testament, and meditation, followed by spiritual seances. One of the women in the group was assigned to be the medium for that day. And the medium exercised automatic writings and mediumistic drawings, which she received from the spirits. Hilma and her group of 5 progressively made contact with spiritual beings. They called these beings the High Ones, much like Blavatsky's masters. The 5 women started taking meticulous notes of the mediumistic messages they would receive from the spirits. With time, Hilma felt that she herself was selected for the more important messages. In fact, Hilma becomes the primary medium making these spirit drawings for the groups. And there's a large number of these journals showing the mediumistic drawings she made during these seances. Within these channeled drawings, we can see symbols that are recurring, such as the snail, the rose, or the cross with the rose, snakes, lilies, and a wide array of botanical imagery. There's also symbolic words and letters like W and U's. I'd like us to take a look at her Primordial Chaos series. Her Primordial Chaos series seems to spring from some of these mediumistic drawings in the journals, but it's a painted series in which she explores the principles of polarity. She furthers the symbolism that she started in the journals. In this series, she really delves into the idea of dualism or duality. Light and dark, good and evil, male and female are all expressed through symbolism and color, and so is their possible reunification. The colors that primarily dominate these paintings are blue, yellow, and green. Hilma attributed the yellow to the masculine or active principle, and she attributed the blue to the female or receptive archetype. The green was their unification. We can see this kind of unification portrayed when this blue line meets this yellow line and they kind of explode in the center. It really looks like 2 sperm or 2 snake meeting together, and right next to the circle, Hilma has written, "It is sanctification." So the meeting of these 2 separate polarities, the unification of them, makes something sanctified. And that's typified by the gold that encases their unification. The letter U and W also frequently appear in her work. The letter W represents matter, while the letter U represents spirit. And of course, when the W and U are put together, it indicates a union of these dualities, a union of spirit and matter. The abstract symbolic language that she began to employ in these paintings was really taken from the journals where she was receiving the messages from the High Ones. In fact, one notebook records a message received in 1907 from the High Ones. They say, "The purpose of these letters is to prepare the way for a language of symbols that has already existed forever and that has now been given to humanity by the creative spirits." Therefore, the High Ones said that they're giving us a symbolism that we can work with. It does remind me a lot of Swedenborg's principle of correspondences and the way that he believed that mankind could talk to gods and angels through telepathic symbols. When we look at Hilma's work, it is so confusing to us because it is like a mysterious language that we're trying to decode. And the reason why I haven't been more specific with some of the other symbols in her work is because this art historians and scholars are still trying to figure out what she meant by these symbols. In fact, Hilma herself was not always sure about the messages that she was receiving. She spent much of her life trying to decode these messages too. I would just like to point out that another symbol that she uses quite often is this spiral shell that has all of these demarcations splitting up the shell. I think this is related to Blavatsky's idea of cycles or spiritual evolution. Blavatsky saw the human race as continually evolving, either descending into matter or at other cycles in time ascending into spirit. And so I think the shell has to do with those cycles, those notches that we keep going through until we complete the cycle. I'm pretty sure that these shell spirals also have something to do with math because they are perfect representations of the Archimedes spiral. Since I am not a mathematician, I cannot speak to this. However, I think it would be great if someone who is more mathematically minded could go in and look at what these may mean in terms of math or physics. Because we know Hilma was staying up to date with the mathematical and scientific advancements of her day. She was very excited when atomic theories were coming out in the early 1900s. She thought that these atomic theories proved that there really was an invisible world behind the visible and supported her spiritual viewpoints in life. On November 4th, 1906, Hilma noted a message from her spirit guides. They told her, "You will commence a task that will bring great blessings on coming generations. Your mission is to open their eyes to a life that lasts for eternity." She felt this message was an important higher calling. She vowed to take on this higher calling, and she began to fulfill her promise in May of 1907 to April of 1908, when she painted the 10 largest. The 10 largest are 10 paintings executed in tempera on paper glued to canvas, and each of these is about 10 feet 5 inches high and nearly 8 feet wide, so they're ridiculously large, and she worked on them on the floor of her studio, rolled out, hunched over, painting or sometimes painting with a long stick so she didn't have to bend over. The 10 largest overall represent the cycle of a human life from birth to death. The first one is titled Infancy and is of dark blue color. The second one, titled Childhood, has a paler blue and introduces oranges. The next set of paintings is entitled Youth, and both of these have a bright, joyful orange color to them. Following Youth, there are 4 paintings with a more subdued purple tone that represent adulthood. And lastly, there are 2 images that portray old age. Both of these seem to have muted color. We can once again see Hilma showing us the importance of the cyclical nature of life. According to Blavatsky, cycles are a part of nature. Everything in nature follows a cycle, whether it's the weather patterns, whether it's geological formations. Evolution follows particular cycles, and these cycles aid in the development of evolution. So in order to grow, we need to go through these different periods. In the first painting, titled Infancy, we see a dark blue background on which a wreath of lilies and a wreath of roses float. In the center, there are two letters that come together, encircled, and then there are these calligraphic squiggles and lines underneath, which don't really spell out anything but seem to be a language of their own. I like to think of the dark blue in the background as the void from which the child is emerging. If you remember, Hilma associated blue with the feminine or with the receptive, as in the womb or the void. The symbol of the rose was actually from the mystery tradition of the Rosicrucian order, which Hilma was also a part of. She tried on a few different spiritualist outfits to see which one suited her. And I think she was interested in all of them, trying to understand all of their philosophies so that she can pull together all this different information and see what spoke to her as the truth. The rose in the Rosicrucian order usually symbolized an unfoldment of consciousness. The Rosicrucians used a rose cross, a cross with a rose in the center, as their main symbol. And the rose in the center was usually seen as the heart center, unfolding and becoming more conscious. Now you'll have to forgive me because I can never correctly pronounce that word, conscious. So I'm probably going to be missaying it for the rest of the lectures. In the second painting, titled Childhood, we see a softer pastel blue background with various organic forms floating on top of it. At the bottom there is a typical Vesica Pisces, a blue and an orange circle overlapping to create a gold Vesica Pisces shape. These organic semi-biological forms appear throughout the rest of the series, and they were actually inspired by a book that Hilma was looking at called Art Forms in Nature. This book was written by Ernst Haeckel, a German zoologist and naturalist who was also an artist. He discovered many new different life forms, and he published his discoveries in these beautiful illustrations in 1904, 3 years before Hilma actually created the 10 largest. Ernst Haeckel was also a proponent of Charles Darwin's evolution theory, which came out in 1859. He helped popularize it, and so we see, once again, Hilma is probably taking the idea of physical evolution from Charles Darwin and spiritual evolution from Blavatsky and combining them together and seeing them as complementary to each other, or as maybe even as the same process, just on different levels. In the paintings representing adulthood, the colors become more muted. The purple is no longer a bright orange. I often think of the bright orange in the childhood and youth paintings as a sign of the spontaneity, innocence, and joyfulness that children have. However, when you get to adulthood, you can see that the paintings are a little bit more somber, and they feel more serious with this muted purple. There's also the introduction of black, which is interesting. In adulthood number 5, we see the Rosicrucian rose at the top of the painting once again, divided into 5 in the center, and underneath there seem to be these mysterious glyphs. These glyphs almost seem to be letters, but they also seem to not be letters. For example, there seems to be a big A in the middle of the center, and maybe an H underneath it. I also believe the H underneath it may actually represent the Pisces symbol. We know Hilma was aware of astrology and the astrological glyphs because she puts them into several of her other paintings, so it's not far-fetched that the Pisces symbol may show up in some of her other works. And next to the Pisces symbol, we see an O, or an egg shape in gold. And Hilma often used an egg shape in her paintings. The egg shape is so universal that it could reference anything from birth, as in the reason why we use eggs for Easter, the beginning of spring, the birth of life. A golden egg shape could also represent an aura or a halo around a person who is becoming more aware, like we saw in the Mondrian evolution triptych. The middle figure had that golden aura emanating from its shoulders. Blavatsky also quotes Timaeus, one of the lecturers from Plato, as saying that the purest spiritual form of the human shape is the egg form. And in this pure spiritual form, humans have no limbs. They are simply a glowing, shining orb. I'm thinking that Hilma may have been aware of this theory by Timaeus because she often enclosed her angels and her human forms within an egg shape. The rest of the adulthood series contains various sets of spirals intersecting, of Vesica Pisces, and of floral and botanical imagery. In the seventh image, we can see a kind of new introduction of the Vesica Pisces based on a more petal-shaped or botanical image, in which the first two petals are at the top intersecting into a Vesica Pisces, and from that comes the third petal below them, the petal that they have created together. The last painting in the adulthood series starts to lose those darker colors like black and more vibrant colors like red. Everything is now purple, blue, yellow, or white, with a little bit of dark red and black in between. And this goes right back to the duality we've seen her paint with before, the blue and the yellow intersecting, the passive and the active coming together. Finally, in the last two paintings, which are called Old Age, we see that most of the color is sucked out of them. They tend to be this ruddy, desaturated pink. And in the final painting, there's just the three primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, in those squares. I find the second to last painting interesting because the botanical shapes at the top of the painting start to morph into purely geometric forms by the bottom of the painting. It's like they're losing all their individuality, they're losing their color, and they're morphing back into these simple Vesica Pisces, and then finally this kind of heart shape or leaf shape that floats down to the bottom of the page with absolutely no color in it. I'm not sure exactly how to read the final painting in this series, as Hilma introduces geometric squares which aren't in any of the other more organic paintings. In one way, you can see that there is a cross inside of these colored squares that is left uncolored. So there may be a reference to Christianity here. The Rosicrucian mystery school was actually a very Christian mystery school. Theosophy, not so much. Theosophy was more based on Eastern principles, so it didn't always carry such a Christian overtone. However, even though we can't really read the mystery of what she meant in this last painting, and much of her painting is still open to interpretation as her life is decoded and as these visual symbols are decoded, we can still appreciate the sheer beauty of these forms that seem so monumental in these very large paintings. And Hilma never showed these during her lifetime. She was told that people were not ready to see these paintings, both by the spirits and by one of her mentors, Rudolf Steiner. In fact, when Hilma died, there was a clause in her will which said that these paintings should not be released into the public until 20 years after her death. She died in the 1940s, and in the 1960s, when some of her relatives went to the museums in Stockholm to introduce these paintings, they were kind of dismissed. Nobody knew who she was. She wasn't an important painter. Nobody really cared. It wasn't really until the 1980s and 1990s that her work began to get exposure. And so here we are, 80 years after her death, really finally starting to look at her work. And the painting exhibit that I saw of her work was called Paintings for the Future. And her work truly was made for the future.